Winter had clawed its way deep into Brooklyn's bones by the time Patrick Holly decided he preferred the company of ghosts to the living. The year was 1952, and the industrial smoke from the Navy Yard hung over his neighborhood like a shroud, thick enough to taste metal on your tongue and dense enough to blur the line between day and night. His house sat on the edge of everything civilized, where cobblestone streets gave way to muddy lots and the gas lamps flickered like dying stars against the perpetual gray. The house itself told the story of better times. 3 stories of red brick, with windows that once gleamed but now stared out like hollow eyes. The front steps, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, led to a door painted green so many years ago that now it looked more like the color of old copper. Inside, the rooms echoed with emptiness, filled only with the furniture Ruth had chosen when they were young and foolish enough to believe love could hold back the world's cruelty. Patrick had been 42 when Ruth died. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though Patrick knew it was really the city that killed her. The soot in her lungs, the stress of watching their neighbors flee to Long Island, the weight of staying in a place that was slowly forgetting how to be kind. She'd coughed for weeks, each sound like glass breaking in his chest, until one morning she simply didn't wake up. That was 30 winters ago, and Patrick Holly had not spoken to another human being since the day they lowered her coffin into the frozen ground at Calvary Cemetery. He'd grown into his solitude like a tree grows around a fence post, absorbing it until it became part of his structure. His hair had gone from brown to silver to white, and his beard now reached nearly to his chest, wild and unkempt. His clothes were practical, durable, chosen for warmth rather than appearance. Wool sweaters with holes he'd mended himself, heavy boots that had walked the same streets for decades, a coat that had seen more winters than most men. The neighborhood around him had changed like water wearing away stone. The Irish families who'd filled the stoops with children and the smell of soda bread had moved away, replaced by Puerto Ricans, then Italians, then nobody at all. Factories closed. Shops boarded up their windows. The synagogue on the corner lost half its congregation to the suburbs, and the Catholic church where he'd married Ruth now held mass for a handful of elderly women who crossed themselves and whispered prayers in languages he didn't recognize. But Patrick remained, as constant as the tide, as predictable as winter. Every morning at dawn, he'd walk to Goldstein's grocery, the only shop still operating within 10 blocks. Mrs. Goldstein, bent with age but sharp as her late husband's razor, would nod and slide his usual order across the counter. Bread, milk, eggs, whatever vegetables hadn't frozen or rotted. Sometimes tea. Never coffee. Coffee was something you shared, and Patrick Holly shared nothing with no one anymore. His days followed a rhythm as precise as clockwork. Morning walk to Goldstein's. Afternoon tending to the small garden behind his house, where he grew potatoes and turnips and the occasional miracle of a tomato that survived Brooklyn's harsh summers. Evening reading by lamplight, the same books over and over. Dickens, Shakespeare, the Bible Ruth had pressed into his hands on their wedding day. He spoke to no one, but he listened to everything. The wind that rattled his windows spoke of storms coming from the harbor. The settling of his house's old bones told him when the temperature was dropping. The distant sound of sirens carried news of the city's endless disasters, none of which touched him in his self-imposed exile. The locals had grown used to him over the decades. Children dared each other to walk past his house after dark, making up stories about the ghost man who lived there. Teenagers called him the Hermit of Hick Street, though his street was actually called Prospect, and it had been called that since before any of them were born. Adults simply pretended he didn't exist, the way city people learn to ignore anything that doesn't directly threaten or benefit them. But Patrick noticed everything. He saw the way the neighborhood was dying, building by building, family by family. He watched apartments empty and stay empty, watched windows get boarded up and stay that way. He observed the increase in broken glass on the sidewalks, the appearance of men who didn't belong, who walked too purposefully and looked too carefully at houses like his. He noted the way Mrs. Goldstein's hands shook more each month, the way she counted her money twice now before making change. The city was changing, and not for the better. There was something hungry in the air, something that fed on loneliness and abandonment. Patrick could feel it pressing against his windows at night, testing his door, looking for ways to get inside. But his solitude had made him stronger in some ways, more aware of danger, more sensitive to the subtle shifts that marked the difference between safety and threat. His house had become his fortress without him ever intending it. Over the years, he'd reinforced the doors, replaced the locks, installed heavy curtains that blocked out prying eyes. The basement held stores of food, candles, oil for the lamps. The attic contained Ruth's things, carefully preserved in trunks that he never opened but could never throw away. And in the hidden space behind the kitchen wall, wrapped in oilcloth and kept dry with packets of salt, lay his father's service revolver from the Great War, loaded and ready though he prayed he'd never need to use it. Winter of 1952 was particularly brutal. Snow fell earlier than usual and stayed longer, piling up in drifts that reached the first-floor windows. The wind howled like something alive and angry, finding every crack in the old house's defenses. The gas lamps that lit the street flickered and went out one by one. Whether from the storm or simple neglect, Patrick couldn't tell. By December, his block was an island of darkness in an already dim part of the city. It was on such a night, when the wind was loud enough to drown out prayer and the snow fell so thick it erased the world beyond his front steps, that Patrick Holly's 30 years of solitude came to an end. Not by his choice, not through any decision on his part, but because sometimes the world comes knocking whether you want it to or not. The sound, when it came, was barely audible over the storm. A soft tapping, so gentle it might have been ice falling from the eaves. Patrick, reading by lamplight in his parlor, almost ignored it. Almost. But something in the rhythm, the persistence of it, made him set down his book and listen more carefully. There it was again. Top, top, top. A pause. Then again. Not ice. Not wind. Someone was at his door. Part February 10th. The unexpected visitors. Patrick Holly's hand trembled as he reached for the door handle. Not from cold but from the shocking realization that another human being stood on his threshold. 30 years of solitude had not prepared him for this moment. Through the frosted glass panel beside his door, he could make out dark shapes huddled against the storm, but the details were lost in the swirling snow and ice. He hesitated, his palm resting on the cold metal of the handle. In 3 decades, no one had knocked on his door with genuine need. There had been the occasional salesman in the early years, city officials checking on property taxes, children playing pranks. But those visits had dwindled to nothing as his reputation for being unreachable spread through the neighborhood. Now, in the midst of the worst blizzard Brooklyn had seen in years, someone had braved the storm to reach his door. The knocking came again, weaker this time, as if whoever stood outside was losing strength. Patrick pressed his ear to the door and heard something that made his heart clench. The sound of a woman crying, not loudly, but with the exhausted desperation of someone who had reached the end of hope. When he finally opened the door, the wind drove snow into his face like needles, and for a moment he couldn't see anything but white chaos. Then the storm shifted, and he beheld a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his days. 10 women stood in his doorway, African-American women of various ages, from teenagers to grandmothers, all of them soaked to the bone despite the heavy snow. Their clothes were inadequate for the weather. Thin coats, worn shoes, some without proper gloves or hats. They huddled together for warmth, their dark skin ashen with cold, their lips blue, their eyes holding the hollow look of people who had been walking through hell. But it was what they carried that broke something inside Patrick's chest. Bundled in the arms of the woman at the front of the group was an infant, wrapped in what had once been a blanket but was now just wet rags. The baby's face was visible, small and dark and terrifyingly still. Its breathing was so shallow that Patrick had to strain to see the tiny chest rising and falling. The woman holding the child looked to be in her 30s, tall and dignified despite her desperate circumstances. Her hair was covered by a soaked kerchief, and her eyes held a strength that reminded Patrick, unexpectedly and painfully, of Ruth. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "Please," she said, the word barely audible over the wind. "We've been walking since yesterday. Got nowhere else to go. This baby, she ain't gonna make it through the night if we don't get warm." Behind her, The other women swayed on their feet. One, elderly with gray hair visible beneath her thin scarf, was being supported by two younger women. Another held a toddler who was crying soundlessly, too cold and tired to make noise. They all bore the marks of exposure. Frostbite on their fingers, snow packed into their shoes, the glassy-eyed look of people approaching hypothermia. Patrick's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. These women had been cast out into the storm, forced to walk through neighborhoods that were hostile to their presence even in good weather, carrying children who were dying from cold. The nearest hospital was miles away, and no taxi would come to this neighborhood in weather like this. They had knocked on his door because it was the only door left, the only light still burning in a block of darkness. Shelter burned down, the woman continued, swaying slightly. They said it was electrical, but we know better. Had to get out fast, couldn't take nothing. Been walking ever since, looking for somewhere, anywhere. Her voice trailed off as she looked down at the baby in her arms. Patrick found himself staring at the child. Even in the dim light from his hallway, he could see that the infant was gravely ill. Its lips were not just blue from cold but had a grayish tinge that spoke of oxygen starvation. Its tiny hands were clenched into fists, and its breathing was rapid and shallow. The woman noticed his gaze. "Her name's Hope," she said softly. "Born just 2 weeks ago. She was doing fine till the fire, till we had to run out into this cold. She need warm milk, warm place to sleep. She need." Her voice broke completely. Patrick looked past the woman with the baby to the others. Each face told a story of loss and desperation. The elderly woman being supported had burns on her hands, probably from trying to save something from the fire. One of the younger women had a cut on her forehead that had frozen over with blood and ice. The toddler had stopped crying but was shivering so violently that Patrick could see it even through the storm. They weren't asking for much, just warmth, just a chance for a dying baby to survive the night, just basic human decency in a world that had shown them precious little of it. For 30 years, Patrick Holly had kept the world at bay. He had chosen isolation, silence, the safety of solitude over the risk of caring about other people. But standing in his doorway, facing these women and children who were quite literally freezing to death, he understood that some choices are made for you by circumstances beyond your control. The wind gusted harder, driving more snow into his hallway, and the baby in the woman's arms made a sound so weak it was more like a sigh than a cry. That sound, barely audible over the storm, made Patrick's decision for him. Part 3 out of 10 silent acceptance. Patrick Holly stepped back from the doorway without a word, opening his door wide and gesturing for the women to enter. He had not spoken aloud in so long that he wasn't sure his voice would work even if he tried to use it. But words seemed inadequate anyway in the face of such desperate need. The women filed past him into his hallway, bringing with them the smell of wet wool, smoke, and fear. They moved slowly, helping each other, the stronger supporting the weaker. Patrick watched them with the detached fascination of someone observing creatures from another world, which in many ways they were. His house had not held this many people since Ruth's funeral 30 years ago. The woman carrying the baby was the last to enter. As she passed him, she looked directly into his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "My name is Hosa Williams. This here is Hope." She adjusted the bundle in her arms, and Patrick caught a glimpse of the infant's face. The baby's skin had a grayish pallor that made his stomach clench with worry. Patrick closed the door against the storm and turned to survey his unexpected guests. They stood uncertainly in his narrow hallway, dripping melted snow onto the wooden floor, unsure of what to do next. The elderly woman was leaning heavily against the wall, her breathing labored. The toddler had been set down and was clinging to the legs of one of the younger women, still shivering violently. Without speaking, Patrick pointed toward his parlor, where the fire was still burning in the grate. The women moved toward the warmth like plants turning toward sunlight. He watched them settle around his fireplace, some sitting in his chairs, others on the floor, all of them extending their hands toward the flames. Hosa remained standing, still holding the baby, looking around the room with sharp, assessing eyes. Patrick could see her taking inventory. The quality of the furniture, the books on the shelves, the photographs of Ruth that still sat on the mantelpiece. She was trying to understand what kind of man had opened his door to them, whether they were safe here. The parlor, which had been Patrick's sanctuary for 3 decades, was transformed by their presence. The silence that had been his constant companion was broken by the soft sounds of people trying to warm themselves. The rustle of wet clothing, quiet murmurs of comfort between the women, the occasional whimper from the toddler. Patrick stood in the doorway, uncertain what to do next. His social skills had atrophied from disuse, and he found himself paralyzed by the complexity of the situation. These women needed food, dry clothes, medical attention for the baby. But he had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten how to be a host, how to care for others. Hosa seemed to sense his uncertainty. She approached him carefully, the baby still in her arms. "You got someplace warm where I can lay her down?" she asked quietly. "Somewhere out of the wind? She need to get her body temperature up." Or, she didn't finish the sentence, but Patrick understood. He led her to his bedroom, the room he had shared with Ruth, the room he had barely entered since her death. The bed was made with clean sheets and warm blankets, just as Ruth would have kept it. Hosa looked at him questioningly, and he nodded his permission. She laid the baby down gently on the bed and began unwrapping the wet rags that served as blankets. What she revealed made Patrick's breath catch in his throat. The infant was smaller than he had expected, clearly premature, with skin so thin he could see the blue tracery of veins beneath. The baby's breathing was rapid and shallow, and when Hosa touched her forehead, she frowned. "She burning up with fever," Hosa said. "Got pneumonia, maybe worse. You got any medicine? Any way to get a doctor?" Patrick shook his head. Even if he had been willing to venture out into the storm, no doctor would come to this neighborhood, especially not for a black baby whose family couldn't pay. Hosa seemed to understand this without explanation. She began removing the baby's wet clothes, handling the tiny body with practiced care. "I need clean cloth," she said. "Hot water. Milk if you got it. Honey too if you have any." Patrick nodded and hurried to gather what she needed. In his kitchen, he found clean dish towels, put water on to boil, and searched his pantry for anything that might help. He had milk several days old but still good. A jar of honey Mrs. Goldstein had sold him months ago. Some brandy that had belonged to Ruth's father. When he returned to the bedroom, Hosa had wrapped the baby in a dry towel and was holding her against her chest, trying to warm her with body heat. The other women had gathered in the doorway, watching anxiously. "This your room?" Hosa asked, looking around at the feminine touches that still marked the space as a woman's domain. Patrick nodded, then realized she might not understand his silence. He forced himself to speak, his voice coming out as a harsh whisper after years of disuse. "My wife's," he managed. Hosa's expression softened. "She passed 30 years ago." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. 30 years of grief, 30 years of solitude, 30 years of keeping this room as a shrine to a love that death had stolen. "She would have wanted you to help," Hosa said with quiet certainty. Patrick knew she was right. Ruth would have opened their home without hesitation, would have given their bed to a dying child, would have nursed the baby through the night if necessary. Ruth had always been the brave one, the one who reached out to others while he held back. He mixed warm milk with honey and a few drops of brandy, as his own mother had done for him when he was sick as a child. Hosa accepted it gratefully and began trying to get the baby to take small sips from a spoon. Most of it ran down the infant's chin, but some went down her throat. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Patrick's house, something had changed. The silence was gone, replaced by the quiet sounds of people caring for each other. The emptiness that had defined his existence for 3 decades was being filled, one small act of kindness at a time. Part 4/10, The Loss That Binds. As the night wore on, Patrick found himself drawn into conversations he hadn't imagined having with anyone, ever again. The women, warmed by his fire and fed with simple food from his pantry, began to share their stories. Not all at once, and not without careful consideration of whether this strange, silent white man could be trusted with their truths. It started with the elderly woman, who introduced herself as Mother Ezra. She had survived 68 years, she told him, and had thought she'd seen every kind of cruelty the world could offer. But the fire at the Harlem shelter had taught her that human malice had no bottom. "Wasn't no electrical fire," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Was 3 men with gasoline and matches. We seen them running away, laughing like they done something clever. 42 people lived in that shelter. 42 people with nowhere else to go, and they burned us out for sport." Patrick, sitting in Ruth's rocking chair while Mother Ezra occupied his usual spot by the fire, felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in decades. Anger on behalf of someone else. The deliberate cruelty of it, the targeting of the most vulnerable people in the city, reminded him of stories his father had told about the old country, about landlords who would burn out tenants rather than deal with repairs. Another woman, younger, introduced herself as Sarah. She had worked as a seamstress until the factory closed, throwing her and 200 other women out of work with no notice and no severance pay. Her husband had been drafted for Korea and hadn't come back. Not dead, she clarified, just never came back. Missing in action, they called it, which was another way of saying they'd lost him somewhere in the mountains and didn't care enough to keep looking. "Had my own place till last month," Sarah said, accepting a cup of tea Patrick had made with hands that shook from nervousness and disuse. "But when you can't pay rent, don't matter how long you've been there, how clean you keep it, how quiet you are. They put your things on the sidewalk and change the locks." The stories continued through the night. Maria, who spoke with a slight accent Patrick couldn't place, had fled something she wouldn't name in the South, bringing her daughter north on promises of factory work that had evaporated the moment she arrived. Dorothy had been a teacher until the school board decided that colored teachers weren't suitable for colored children, leaving her educated but unemployable. Each story was different in its details but identical in its core. Systems that had failed them, institutions that had rejected them, a society that had decided their lives were disposable. They had all lost homes, jobs, family members, dreams. They were survivors in the truest sense, people who had endured more than should be humanly possible and were still standing. Patrick found himself sharing, haltingly, his own story. Not the whole truth, he wasn't ready for that, but pieces of it. How Ruth had died, how the neighborhood had changed, how he had retreated from a world that seemed determined to take everything he cared about. "Grief makes you do strange things," Mother Ezra said when he finished describing his 30 years of solitude. "Some people, they throw themselves into busyness. Like if they move fast enough, the hurt can't catch them. Others, they go quiet like you done. Both ways, you're just trying to survive something that feels bigger than you are." Hosa, who had been mostly silent while tending to the baby, looked up from where she sat on the floor. "My husband died in France," she said quietly. "D-Day. Never got to see his daughter born. Never got to hold her." She adjusted baby Hope in her arms, and Patrick noticed the infant's breathing seemed slightly stronger. "I named her Hope because that's all I had left," Hosa continued. "Hope that maybe things would get better, that maybe this country would remember that colored folks bled for it too, that maybe our children would have chances we never got." She looked down at the baby, whose fever seemed to be breaking. "But hope's a dangerous thing when the world keeps trying to kill it." Patrick understood exactly what she meant. He had hoped once that Ruth would recover, had hoped the neighborhood would come back to life, had hoped that grief would eventually fade into something manageable. When hope kept being disappointed, it became easier to stop hoping altogether. But sitting in his parlor, surrounded by women who had every reason to despair but hadn't, Patrick felt something he had thought was dead in him stirring back to life. Not hope exactly, but something similar. The possibility that caring about other people might be worth the risk of losing them. The baby made a small sound, stronger than before, and Hosa smiled for the first time since arriving. "She's gonna make it," she said with quiet confidence. "Fever's breaking, breathing's getting easier. She's gonna make it through the night." Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but inside Patrick's house, something was building strength. These women, thrown together by circumstance and cruelty, were becoming something more than just refugees sharing shelter. They were becoming a family of sorts, bound not by blood but by shared loss and mutual care. Patrick rose to add more wood to the fire, and as he did, he caught sight of Ruth's photograph on the mantelpiece. For the first time in 30 years, looking at her face didn't bring only pain. There was something else there now, a sense that she would approve of what was happening in their home, that she would understand why he had opened his door to these strangers who were becoming less strange with every shared story. The night was far from over, and morning would bring new challenges. But for now, in the warm glow of the firelight, with the sound of baby Hope's steady breathing and the quiet murmur of women who had found safety, Patrick Holly allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in 3 decades. The possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. Part May 10th. Signs of danger. Dawn brought an uneasy quiet that had nothing to do with the end of the storm. Patrick woke in his chair by the cold fireplace, his back aching from sleeping upright, to find his house filled with the unfamiliar sounds of other people stirring awake. Soft conversations in the parlor, the creak of floorboards as someone moved carefully through his hallway, the gentle sound of Hosa singing a lullaby to baby Hope. He had given his bedroom to Hosa and the baby, and the other women had made themselves comfortable throughout the house. Mother Ezra had claimed the sofa in the parlor, while the younger women had arranged themselves on blankets on the floor. They had been respectful of his space, careful not to disturb his belongings, but their presence had changed everything about the house's atmosphere. Patrick made his way to the kitchen to start coffee, a ritual he hadn't shared with anyone since Ruth's death. As he worked, he could hear the women discussing practical matters, what they would do now, where they might go, how long they could reasonably impose on his hospitality. Their voices were kept low, considerate of his privacy, but he caught enough to understand that they were as uncertain about their future as he was. It was Sarah who first noticed the tracks in the snow outside the kitchen window. She had been helping Patrick prepare a simple breakfast when she paused, staring out at his small backyard with a frown of concentration. "Mr. Holly," she said quietly, "you expecting anyone today?" Patrick joined her at the window and felt his blood chill. The snow in his yard, which should have been unmarked except for his own footprints to the woodshed, was crisscrossed with the tracks of at least 3 different people. Boot prints, too large and too heavy to belong to any of the women. Some of the tracks circled his house completely, as if someone had been conducting a surveillance operation. "They was here while we was sleeping," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Walking all around, looking in windows maybe, counting how many of us there are." Patrick's hands clenched involuntarily. He had hoped that the storm would provide them with a few days of peace, a chance for the women to recover their strength before facing whatever came next. But it seemed the world had not forgotten about them, even in this remote corner of Brooklyn. Over the next 2 days, the signs of danger multiplied. Horse prints appeared alongside the boot tracks, suggesting that their watchers had access to transportation and resources. Someone had been through his woodshed, not taking anything but clearly examining his tools, his supplies, his preparations. Most disturbing of all, on the 3rd morning, Patrick discovered that someone had attempted to set fire to the small storage building behind his house. The fire had failed to catch, dampened by snow and the building's solid stone construction, but the smell of kerosene was unmistakable. Someone had soaked rags in fuel and stuffed them under the door, then lit them and fled. Only the weather had prevented Patrick's home from burning down around them. Hosa was the first to speak the truth that everyone was thinking. "They know we're here," she said, standing at the kitchen table with baby Hope in her arms. The infant was thriving now, pink-cheeked and alert, but Hosa's face was drawn with worry. "Don't know who they are exactly, but they know we here, and they don't like it." Mother Ezra, whose age had not diminished her sharp understanding of danger, nodded grimly. "Could be anyone. Could be folks who burned out the shelter, angry that we survived. Could be neighbors who don't like seeing colored faces in this part of town. Could be police who think we're trespassing, or politicians who think we're troublemakers. Could be all of them," Dorothy added. She had been the most quiet of the group, but her years as a teacher had taught her to observe carefully and think strategically. Question is, what they planning to do about it and when they planning to do it. Patrick found himself in the unfamiliar position of being responsible for other people's safety. For 30 years, he had only had to protect himself, and his strategy had been simple. Avoid contact, avoid conflict, avoid attention. But that approach wouldn't work now. These women had already drawn attention simply by existing, and his house had become a target by association. That evening, as the women settled around his parlor for what had become their nightly gathering, Patrick made a decision that surprised himself. He left the room without explanation and returned carrying his father's service revolver, along with a small wooden box containing ammunition. The women stared at the weapons with expressions ranging from fear to grim satisfaction. It was Mother Ezra who spoke first. "You know how to use that thing?" Patrick nodded. His father had taught him to shoot before he was 12, and 30 years of solitude had not erased those lessons. But he had hoped never to need them. "I got a better question," Hosa said, shifting baby Hope to her other arm. "You willing to use it? Because showing a gun is one thing. Being ready to kill another human being is something else entirely." Patrick considered the question seriously. 3 days ago, he would have said no without hesitation. Violence was something that happened to other people in other places in other lives than his. But looking around at the faces of these women, at baby Hope sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, at Mother Ezra whose hands still bore scars from trying to save her belongings from the shelter fire, Patrick realized that some things were worth fighting for. "If they come for you," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since Ruth's death, "they'll have to go through me first." Sarah laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Mr. Holly, I appreciate the sentiment, I truly do. But one man with one gun against however many they might bring? That ain't going to be enough." "Then we need to even the odds," Dorothy said quietly. All eyes turned to her, and she continued with the measured tone of someone who had thought this through carefully. "We need to learn to defend ourselves. All of us." Over the next several days, Patrick's house was transformed into something resembling a military training camp. He taught the women to load and fire his revolver, taking them into his basement where the sound would be muffled. Most had never held a gun before Sarah proved to be a natural shot, steady-handed and clear-eyed. Mother Ezra's arthritis made it difficult for her to grip the weapon properly, but her determination was fierce. They practiced in shifts, with some women training while others kept watch at the windows. Patrick shared what he knew about defending a house, which windows provided the best vantage points, where the strongest doors were located, how to barricade entrances if necessary. But even as they prepared, the signs of approaching danger continued to accumulate. More tracks in the snow, now including what appeared to be multiple horses. Strange men asking questions at Goldstein's grocery about the hermit and whether he had visitors. A wagon that had been seen several times on their street, moving slowly, its occupants studying Patrick's house with obvious interest. The attack, when it came, would not be a surprise. But that didn't mean they were ready for it. Part 6/10, the first battle. The attack came at dawn on the 8th day, when the sky was still gray and the world was caught between night and morning. Patrick had been expecting it, had prepared for it, but the reality of violence was always different from the anticipation of it. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault that spoke of military planning and serious intent. Patrick counted at least 12 men, maybe more, emerging from the morning mist like ghosts materializing into flesh. Some wore the remnants of police uniforms, others the rough clothes of dock workers and factory hands. All carried weapons: clubs, knives, a few pistols, and at least one rifle that Patrick could see. The leader was a man Patrick recognized from his occasional trips to Goldstein's store. Detective Frank Morrison, a corrupt cop who had been taking bribes from dock workers for years and was known throughout the neighborhood for his particular hatred of anyone who wasn't white, Irish, and Catholic. Morrison had clearly assembled a mob of like-minded individuals, united by their shared desire to drive the women from Patrick's house and, probably, to make an example of him for harboring them. Patrick had positioned himself at his bedroom window, which provided the best view of the street and the clearest field of fire. The women had taken their assigned positions throughout the house, Sarah at the kitchen window, Dorothy in the parlor, Mother Ezra in the basement with Hosa and baby Hope. The plan was simple. Hold the house as long as possible, make the attackers pay for every inch they tried to take, and hope that someone would hear the gunfire and summon help. The first shot came from Morrison himself, aimed at Patrick's front door. The bullet splintered the wood but didn't penetrate completely. It was clearly meant as a signal, a declaration that the talking was over and the killing was about to begin. Patrick returned fire immediately, his father's revolver bucking in his hand with familiar authority. His shot took one of Morrison's men in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him sprawling into the snow. The man's scream of pain and surprise seemed to shock the attackers, as if they hadn't expected their victims to fight back. But their pause lasted only seconds. Then they rushed the house from all sides, shouting curses and threats, their voices carrying the ugly edge of men who had convinced themselves that violence was justified, even righteous. Sarah's rifle cracked from the kitchen window, and another attacker went down, clutching his leg. Dorothy, positioned behind the heavy wooden shutters of the parlor window, fired through a gap and heard her bullet strike the front porch with a sharp crack. The attackers quickly realized that a frontal assault would be costly. They took cover behind Patrick's fence, behind neighboring houses, behind anything that would stop a bullet. Morrison, blood running from a graze on his cheek where one of Patrick's shots had come too close, began shouting orders. "Burn them out," he yelled. "Get the kerosene from the wagon." Patrick's heart sank. He had prepared for a gunfight, but not for an arson attack. If they succeeded in setting the house on fire, he and the women would be faced with an impossible choice: burn alive or run outside into the guns of the waiting mob. But Sarah had anticipated this tactic. From her position in the kitchen, she had a clear shot at the wagon where the attackers had stored their supplies. Her rifle spoke twice in quick succession, and suddenly the wagon was engulfed in flames as the kerosene they had brought to burn Patrick's house consumed their own vehicle instead. The explosion sent attackers scrambling for new cover, and the distraction gave Patrick the opportunity he needed. He moved from window to window, firing carefully aimed shots that kept the mob pinned down and unable to organize another coordinated rush. From the basement, he could hear Hosa singing softly to baby Hope, trying to keep the infant calm despite the chaos above. The sound gave him strength, reminded him what he was fighting for. These weren't just women who had sought shelter in his house. They were people he had come to care about, people whose lives had become precious to him. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Patrick's ammunition was running low, and he could see that the attackers were regrouping for another assault. Morrison had produced a second pistol and was directing his men to positions that would allow them to fire into the house from multiple angles. Then Sarah made a decision that changed everything. Instead of staying at her assigned window, she grabbed the rifle and ran for the front door.
"Sarah, no."
Patrick shouted, but she was already outside, using his front porch as cover while she fired down at the attackers from an elevated position. Her bold move caught Morrison's mob off guard. They had expected their victims to cower inside the house, not to take the fight to them. Sarah's rifle cracked repeatedly, and Patrick could see attackers diving for cover as her bullets kicked up snow and splinters around their hiding spots. But her exposed position made her a target for every gun the mob possessed. Patrick watched in horror as multiple muzzle flashes lit up the morning gloom, all aimed at the brave woman who had risked everything to protect her new family. Sarah staggered, blood blooming across her shoulder, but she didn't fall. Instead, she steadied herself against the porch railing and continued firing, her face set in grim determination. Patrick made his own desperate choice. He burst from the house, his revolver in one hand and Ruth's old kitchen knife in the other, charging directly at Morrison's position. His sudden appearance in the open apparently shocked the detective, who had clearly expected the hermit of Hick Street to be a coward. The two men met in Patrick's front yard, surrounded by snow that was rapidly being stained red with blood from the wounded on both sides. Morrison was younger and stronger, but Patrick fought with the fury of a man who had finally found something worth dying for. They grappled for control of Morrison's pistol, rolling in the snow, each trying to gain the advantage. Patrick could hear the battle continuing around them. Sarah's rifle still firing from the porch, Dorothy shouting encouragement from the parlor window, the curses and screams of men who had expected an easy victory and found a war instead. Morrison managed to get his gun barrel pressed against Patrick's ribs, but before he could pull the trigger, Sarah's bullet took him in the head. The corrupt detective collapsed into the snow, his blood spreading in a dark stain that seemed to capture all the ugliness he had brought to this quiet street. With their leader dead, the remaining attackers lost their stomach for the fight. They retreated, carrying their wounded, leaving behind 3 dead men and the burning wagon as evidence of their failed assault. Patrick lay in the snow for a moment, breathing hard, hardly able to believe he was still alive. Then he heard baby Hope crying from inside the house, and he remembered that survival was just the beginning. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Part 7/10 New arrivals and another child. 3 days after the battle, as Patrick was boarding up the bullet holes in his windows and Sarah was recovering from her shoulder wound, they found the baby. She was lying on the front steps, wrapped in a clean blanket despite the morning frost, with a single white feather tucked into the folds of cloth near her tiny face. Someone had left her there during the night, sometime between Patrick's last security check at midnight and dawn. She couldn't have been more than a few hours old, her umbilical cord still showing signs of recent birth, her skin pink and healthy despite the cold. Hosa was the first to reach her, drawn by the infant's strong, lusty cries that echoed through the early morning quiet. She knelt on the steps, carefully lifting the bundle, her experienced hands checking for signs of injury or illness. "She's perfect," Hosa announced, her voice filled with wonder. "Strong lungs, good color, probably born just before they brought her here. Somebody wanted her to live." Patrick stood behind her, staring down at the tiny face that was scrunched up in indignation at being left in the cold. The baby had dark hair and skin that suggested mixed heritage, which probably explained why she had been abandoned. In 1952 Brooklyn, a child who couldn't be easily categorized was often a child nobody wanted to claim. "Why here?" Dorothy asked, emerging from the house with Mother Ezra close behind. "Why bring a baby to us?" Mother Ezra examined the white feather, turning it over in her weathered fingers. "This here's a mourning dove feather," she said quietly. "My grandmother used to say they appeared when someone passed from one world to the next. Could be whoever left this baby knew her mama died birthing her." Sarah, her arm still in a sling from the bullet wound, had a different theory. "Could be they heard about the fight," she suggested. "Word travels fast in neighborhoods like this. Maybe they figured anyone willing to take bullets for strangers might be willing to take in an unwanted child." Patrick found himself thinking about the tracks they had been finding around his house in the days since the attack. Not all of them had belonged to Morrison's mob. Some had been smaller, lighter, made by someone who moved carefully and avoided detection. Someone had been watching them, studying them, making judgments about their character. Hosa had already made her decision. "We're keeping her," she announced, cradling the infant against her chest. "Anyone who leaves a baby on our doorstep is trusting us to do right by her. We can't betray that trust." "What do we call her?" Mother Ezra asked. Patrick surprised himself by speaking first. "Alice," he said, the name emerging from some deep place in his memory. "Her name is Alice." The women looked at him curiously, and he realized he needed to explain. "It was Ruth's middle name," he said. "Ruth Alice O'Brien, before she became Ruth Alice Holly. She always said if we had a daughter, we'd call her Alice." Hosa smiled, the first truly happy expression Patrick had seen on her face since the night she'd arrived at his door. "Alice it is, then. Alice Holly, if you don't mind sharing your name with another orphan." Patrick found that he didn't mind at all. In fact, the idea of his name continuing, of being attached to new life instead of just old grief, filled him with an unexpected warmth. But Alice's arrival also brought practical challenges. They now had 2 infants to care for, along with 8 adults crowded into a house designed for 2. The battle with Morrison's mob had drawn attention from the authorities, and it was only a matter of time before someone official came knocking, asking questions about the gunfight that had left 3 men dead on a quiet Brooklyn street. More immediately pressing was the matter of supplies. Baby Alice needed clothes, bottles, proper blankets. Hope was growing rapidly and would soon outgrow the makeshift garments the women had fashioned for her. And all of them needed more food, more fuel for heating, more of everything that money could buy. It was Dorothy who proposed a solution. "I still have some connections," she said. "Teachers, social workers, people who believe in doing right even when the system makes it hard. Maybe they can help with supplies, maybe even with finding us a bigger place. And maybe they'll turn us in to the authorities," Sarah countered, her recent experience with violence having made her more suspicious of outsiders. "We need allies," Mother Ezra said firmly. "Can't do this alone, not with babies to think about. We got to trust somebody, might as well trust people who chose to help instead of people who chose to hurt." Over the next week, Dorothy's network proved invaluable. A former colleague brought baby clothes and formula. A social worker who had once been Dorothy's student arrived with blankets and medical supplies. A priest from St. Mary's, the Catholic church where Patrick had married Ruth 33 years earlier, came by with groceries and a promise to ask no questions about what he had seen. Each visitor brought not just supplies but information. The city was changing, they learned. The old neighborhoods were being torn down to make way for highways and housing projects. The people who had lived in those neighborhoods were being scattered, displaced, forced to find new homes wherever they could. "There's going to be more of us," the social worker, a young black woman named Grace, explained. "More families with nowhere to go, more children who need homes. The question is, what are you planning to do about it?" Patrick looked around his parlor, which now served as a nursery for Alice and Hope, a classroom where Dorothy was teaching some of the neighborhood children to read, and a meeting place where the women planned their daily survival. His house had already become something he never could have imagined. A refuge, a community, a place where people could come to rebuild their lives. "We need more space," he said, speaking the obvious truth that everyone had been thinking. Grace smiled. "I might know someone who can help with that. There's a man I've been working with, a Jewish fellow who lost his family in the war. He's been buying up abandoned buildings, trying to create places where refugees can start over. His name is Emmett Goldberg, and I think you two might understand each other." The introduction was arranged for the following Sunday. Patrick, who hadn't voluntarily met a stranger in 30 years, found himself nervous as he prepared for the visit. But when Emmett Goldberg arrived at his door, Patrick immediately understood what Grace had meant about them understanding each other. Emmett was a thin, quiet man in his 50s, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that held the kind of sadness that comes from losing everything that matters. He moved carefully, spoke softly, and observed everything with the attention of someone who had learned that survival depended on noticing details that others missed. "Grace tells me you've been taking in strays," Emmett said, accepting a cup of tea from Hosa while Alice slept peacefully in his arms. "They took me in too," Patrick replied, realizing as he said it that it was true. These women had rescued him from a life of solitude as surely as he had rescued them from the storm. Emmett nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I have a building," he said. 3 stories, good foundation, needs work but it's sound. Used to be a boarding house before the war. I bought it from the city for taxes owed. Been wondering what to do with it." He looked around Patrick's crowded parlor, taking in the makeshift sleeping arrangements, the children playing on the floor, the women who had created a family from necessity and choice. "Might be just the thing for a growing community," he said quietly. "If you're interested in growing, that is." Part 8/10 expansion. Not just shelter but community. The building Emmett Goldberg showed them was everything he had promised and more. Located 6 blocks from Patrick's house, in a section of Brooklyn that had been abandoned by everyone except those who had nowhere else to go, it stood 3 stories tall with solid brick walls and windows that still held most of their glass. The structure had good bones, as Mother Ezra observed during their first tour. High ceilings, wide hallways, rooms large enough for families but small enough to feel cozy. The ground floor had once housed a restaurant, with a kitchen designed to feed dozens of people and a main room that could serve as a gathering place. The upper floors contained 22 individual rooms, each with its own window and enough space for a bed, a chair, and the few possessions that refugees typically carried. But the building also needed work, more work than Patrick had initially realized. The roof leaked in several places. The plumbing was antiquated and partially frozen. The electrical system consisted of bare wires strung along the walls, a fire hazard that would need to be completely replaced. The heating system had been scavenged for scrap metal, leaving only empty pipes and the promise of cold winters. "It's going to take months to make this livable," Sarah said, standing in the main room and looking up at water stains on the ceiling. "Years, more likely," Dorothy added, testing the stability of a staircase banister that wobbled ominously under her touch. But Patrick could see the potential that lay beneath the decay. With proper repairs, this building could house 50 people comfortably. The kitchen could feed twice that many. The main room could host meetings, classes, celebrations, all the activities that made a collection of individuals into a community. Emmett had offered the building rent-free for the first year, with an option to purchase at a nominal price if they could demonstrate that they were serious about creating something permanent. It was an incredibly generous offer, but it came with responsibilities that made Patrick's head spin. They would need to organize themselves legally, probably as some kind of charitable organization. They would need to establish relationships with city officials, police, fire department, health inspectors, all the bureaucrats who could shut them down if they decided the operation was illegal or undesirable. Most importantly, they would need to find steady sources of income to pay for repairs, utilities, food, and all the other expenses that came with housing and feeding dozens of people. The work began immediately, even before they had figured out all the legal complications. Emmett proved to be not just a benefactor but a skilled carpenter and electrician, knowledge he had acquired during his years in displaced persons camps after the war. He taught Patrick and some of the women how to repair roof leaks, how to install safe wiring, how to make old plumbing function again. Dorothy took charge of organizing the educational activities. She established a school in one of the larger rooms, teaching not just children but adults who had never had the opportunity to learn to read and write. Her classes were informal but rigorous, covering everything from basic literacy to practical skills like managing money and understanding legal documents. Sarah, despite her still healing shoulder, became the community's liaison with the outside world. She had a gift for talking to officials, for explaining their mission in terms that bureaucrats could understand and approve. When the fire inspector came by, she walked him through their safety procedures and showed him the new electrical work. When the health department sent someone to examine their kitchen, she demonstrated their food handling practices and presented them with certificates from a food safety course she had taken at the YMCA. Hosa emerged as the community's unofficial medical practitioner. Her experience caring for Hope and Alice had revealed a natural talent for healing, and she began treating not just the residents of their building but neighbors who couldn't afford doctors. She set up a clinic in a ground floor room, stocking it with supplies donated by sympathetic medical professionals that Grace had recruited. Mother Ezra, despite her age, became the community's keeper of wisdom and resolver of disputes. When conflicts arose between residents, as they inevitably did when people from different backgrounds were forced to live in close quarters, she mediated with a combination of maternal authority and practical common sense that usually resulted in peaceful solutions. But it was the children who truly transformed the building from a shelter into a home. Hope and Alice were joined by other infants, toddlers, school-age children, and teenagers, all of them refugees from circumstances beyond their control. Some had been orphaned by the war in Korea. Others had been displaced by urban renewal projects that had torn down their neighborhoods. A few had simply been abandoned by families who couldn't feed another mouth. The children brought noise, chaos, energy, and joy to the old building. Their laughter echoed through the halls. Their games spilled from room to room and floor to floor. Their presence demanded that the adults think about the future, not just survival in the present. Patrick found himself appointed as the unofficial grandfather to all of them. The children seemed to sense that his long silence had made him a good listener, and they brought him their problems, their fears, their excitement about small victories and minor adventures. He taught them to play chess using a set Emmett had carved from wood scraps. He told them stories about Brooklyn in the old days, when the neighborhood had been full of families and hope. But perhaps most importantly, the children brought the community to the attention of people who might otherwise have ignored them. It was hard to dismiss a group of refugees as troublemakers when those refugees were caring for babies and teaching children to read. The sight of Hope taking her first steps in the building's main room, or Alice laughing as Patrick bounced her on his knee, reminded visitors that this was a place where life was being nurtured, not just sustained. 6 months after moving into the building, they received their first official recognition. The city sent a representative from the Department of Social Services, not to shut them down, but to see if they qualified for funding as a community center serving displaced persons. The representative, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson who had clearly expected to find chaos and squalor, instead discovered an organized operation with waiting lists for both housing and educational programs. She interviewed residents, examined their records, observed their daily operations, and left with a promise to recommend them for a small but crucial grant that would help cover their operating expenses. "What do you call this place?" she asked Patrick as she prepared to leave. Patrick looked around the main room, where Hope was playing with wooden blocks while Alice napped in Hosa's arms, where Dorothy was teaching a literacy class to 6 adults, where Mother Ezra was settling a dispute between 2 teenage boys who had been fighting over kitchen duties. "Home," he said simply. "We call it home." But even as their community grew and stabilized, Patrick knew that their biggest challenges lay ahead. Success brought visibility, and visibility brought both supporters and enemies. Word was spreading through Brooklyn that a group of refugees had created something special, something that offered hope to people who had been written off by society. That kind of attention could be a blessing or a curse, depending on who was paying attention and what they planned to do about it. Part 9/10 Authority discovers. The official visit came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, when the building was bustling with its usual activity. Children were attending Dorothy's morning lessons, Hosa was treating a neighbor's infected cut in her makeshift clinic, and Patrick was in the kitchen helping prepare lunch for 43 residents and the various people from the neighborhood who had begun showing up for their daily meal program. The knock on the front door was authoritative, demanding immediate attention. Through the glass, Patrick could see 3 figures: 2 men in dark suits and a woman carrying a leather briefcase. Their stance and expression suggested they were not here to offer congratulations on the community's success. Patrick wiped his hands on his apron and opened the door to find himself facing Inspector Harold Morrison. No relation to the dead detective who had attacked his house, but possessed of the same suspicious nature and hostile attitude toward anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of acceptable citizens. "Mr. Holly," Morrison said, consulting a clipboard, "I'm Inspector Morrison from the Department of Building Safety. This is Mrs. Janet Crawford from the Bureau of Child Welfare, and Detective Ray Sullivan from the precinct. We're here to conduct an inspection of this facility." Patrick's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of inspection?" "We've received complaints," Mrs. Crawford said, pushing past him into the main room without waiting for an invitation. "Anonymous reports suggesting that this establishment is operating without proper permits, housing minors in unsafe conditions, and providing medical care without proper licensing." Patrick could see the officials taking in the scene. Children playing quietly in one corner while adults attended Dorothy's literacy class, the smell of soup cooking in the kitchen, the generally clean and well-organized appearance of the space. But he also knew they were looking for violations, for reasons to shut down what they clearly viewed as an unauthorized and potentially dangerous operation. "How many people are currently residing here?" Inspector Morrison asked, making notes on his clipboard. 43, Patrick answered honestly. He had learned from Sarah that lying to officials usually made things worse. "And how many of those are minors?" Patrick did the mental calculation. 18 under the age of 16. 9 more between 16 and 18. Mrs. Crawford frowned. "This building is not licensed as a children's home or orphanage. You have no legal authority to house these minors." "They're not orphans," Hosa said, emerging from her clinic with baby Alice in her arms. "They're children staying with their families or with people who've taken responsibility for them. Same as any boarding house." "And you are?" Detective Sullivan asked, his tone suggesting he already disapproved of whatever answer she might give. "Hosa Williams. I help run the medical clinic here." "Are you a licensed physician?" "No, sir. I'm a mother who knows how to tend to sick folks." Then you're practicing medicine without a license, Mrs. Crawford said, making a note in her briefcase. That's a serious offense. The inspection continued for 2 hours. The officials examined every room, questioned residents, took photographs, and compiled a list of violations that seemed to grow longer with each passing minute. They found fault with the building's fire exits, criticized the kitchen's food storage practices, and expressed concern about the educational program that Dorothy was operating without official credentials. But it was their interaction with the children that revealed the true nature of their visit. Mrs. Crawford separated several of the younger children from their caregivers, asking them questions designed to elicit complaints about their living conditions or treatment. "Are you happy here?" she asked 6-year-old Marcus, one of the Korean War orphans who had arrived the previous month. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. "Miss Dorothy teaches me to read, and Mr. Patrick shows me how to play chess, and Hope shares her toys with me. But wouldn't you rather live with a real family? People who look like you?" Marcus considered this seriously. "These are real people," he said finally, "and they look like people who love me." Similar conversations with other children produced similar results. The kids were clearly thriving, despite the officials' obvious expectations that they would reveal abuse or neglect. Inspector Morrison seemed particularly frustrated by the building's general state of repair. Emmett's work had been thorough and professional, meeting or exceeding most safety codes. The electrical system was not only functional but better than what existed in many officially licensed facilities. The plumbing worked, the roof didn't leak, and the heating system that Emmett had installed was actually more efficient than the original. "Nevertheless," Morrison said as he prepared to leave, "this facility is operating outside the bounds of municipal regulation. You have 30 days to either obtain proper licensing or close down operations." "What kind of licensing would we need?" Patrick asked. Mrs. Crawford consulted her briefcase. "You'd need to register as either a boarding house, which requires individual background checks on all residents and limits the number of unrelated people who can live together, or as a charitable institution, which requires incorporation, a board of directors, annual financial audits, and compliance with numerous state and federal regulations. And if we can't meet those requirements in 30 days, then we'll be forced to close you down," Detective Sullivan said. "The minors will be placed in appropriate foster care or institutional settings, and the adults will need to find other accommodations." After the officials left, Patrick called a meeting of all the adult residents. The main room filled with people who had found safety and purpose in the building, who had created lives and relationships that gave meaning to their survival. 30 days isn't enough time to jump through all their hoops," Sarah said. "Even if we had lawyers and accountants working around the clock, we couldn't meet all those requirements." "Maybe that's the point," Dorothy suggested. "Maybe they don't want us to succeed. Maybe they'd rather scatter us all back to wherever we came from. Pretend we don't exist." Mother Ezra, now in her 70s and the unofficial elder of the community, stood slowly. "I've been through this before," she said. "Back in Alabama before I came north. White folks would find reasons to shut down anything colored folks built that was too successful, too independent. Made them nervous to see us taking care of ourselves. So what do we do?" Hosa asked, bouncing baby Hope on her knee. Patrick looked around the room at the faces of people who had become his family, at children who called him grandfather, at women who had trusted him with their lives and their hopes. 30 years of solitude had ended when these people came to his door. He wasn't about to let some bureaucrats send them back into the cold. "We fight," he said quietly. "We find lawyers, we file papers, we meet their requirements. And if they try to shut us down anyway, we make enough noise that the whole city knows what they're doing." Emmett, who had been silent during the meeting, finally spoke. "I know some people," he said. "Lawyers who specialize in civil rights, social workers who understand the system, journalists who might be interested in this story. Give me a few days to make some calls." As the meeting broke up, Patrick found himself standing with Hope in his arms, looking around the main room that had become the heart of their community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, new battles to fight. But tonight, surrounded by the people he had learned to love, Patrick Holly felt something he hadn't experienced since Ruth's death. The certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The question was whether that would be enough to save what they had built together. Part October 10th. New life among the old city. 5 years had passed since that snowy night when 10 desperate women knocked on Patrick Holly's door, and the transformation was so complete that sometimes he wondered if he was living in a dream. The building that had once been a derelict boarding house now bustled with life from dawn until well past sunset. What had started as a desperate shelter for refugees had evolved into something unprecedented in Brooklyn. A truly integrated community where people of different races, religions, and backgrounds lived together as neighbors, friends, and family. The legal battles had been fierce but ultimately successful. Emmett's connections had led them to a young civil rights lawyer named David Chun, who had taken their case pro bono and guided them through the maze of municipal regulations. They had incorporated as the Brooklyn Community House, with Patrick serving as chairman of a board that included Dorothy, Hosa, Mother Ezra, and several community supporters. The incorporation process had taken 8 months and required testimony before 3 different city committees, but the result was a legally recognized institution with the right to operate as both a residence and a community center. More importantly, their legal status had given them access to federal funding programs designed to help displaced persons and urban renewal victims. The building now housed 68 residents, ranging in age from baby Alice, who was approaching her 5th birthday, to Mother Ezra, who had celebrated her 73rd birthday the previous month with a party that filled the main room with laughter and music. The residents represented a dozen different ethnicities and spoke 8 languages among them, but they had created a common culture based on mutual support and shared responsibility. Dorothy's educational programs had expanded to include not just basic literacy, but job training, citizenship classes, and college preparation courses taught by volunteers from Brooklyn College. The basement had been converted into workshops where residents learned carpentry, sewing, small appliance repair, and other skills that could lead to employment. The success rate was remarkable. Over 80% of adult residents found steady work within their first year at the community house. Hosa's medical clinic had been licensed by the state and now employed 2 part-time nurses and a retired doctor who donated his services 3 days a week. They treated not just residents but anyone from the neighborhood who couldn't afford regular medical care. The clinic's reputation had spread throughout Brooklyn, drawing patients from as far away as Queens and the Bronx. But it was the children who remained the heart of the community. Hope, now 5 years old, was a bright, energetic child who seemed to have inherited her mother's healing instincts and Patrick's quiet wisdom. She moved through the building like a small ambassador, greeting newcomers, comforting homesick residents, and mediating disputes between the older children with remarkable maturity. Alice, despite her mysterious origins, had grown into a confident 4-year-old who showed an early aptitude for mathematics and an insatiable curiosity about how things worked. She followed Emmett around during his maintenance activities, asking endless questions about electricity, plumbing, and construction techniques. Everyone agreed she would probably become an engineer when she grew up. The 2 girls had become inseparable, sisters in every way that mattered. They shared a room on the 2nd floor, spent their days exploring every corner of the building, and had appointed themselves as Patrick's official helpers in all his daily activities. Patrick himself had changed as much as anyone. The solitary hermit who had spoken to no one for 30 years had become the unofficial grandfather to dozens of children and the trusted counselor to adults facing difficult decisions. His hair was completely white now, and his face bore the lines that came from laughter as much as from sorrow. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from the battle with Detective Morrison's mob, but his step was lighter than it had been in decades. The Brooklyn Community House had become a model that other cities were studying and attempting to replicate. Social workers came from as far away as California to observe their programs and interview their residents. Academic researchers wrote papers about their success in creating stable, integrated housing. Politicians cited them as an example of what was possible when government and private charity worked together effectively. But success had also brought new challenges. The neighborhood around them was changing rapidly as urban renewal projects demolished old buildings to make way for highways and housing projects. Property values were rising, and there was increasing pressure from developers who wanted to buy their building and convert it into expensive apartments. Some residents had moved on to homes of their own, replaced by new arrivals who brought different needs and different challenges. The community house had to constantly adapt its programs and policies to serve a changing population while maintaining the spirit of mutual support that had made it successful. On this particular evening in late spring, Patrick sat on the front steps of the building, watching Hope and Alice play with other children in the small park that the community had created in what had once been a vacant lot. The park featured playground equipment built by residents, gardens tended by anyone who wanted to participate, and benches where neighbors gathered to talk, play chess, or simply watch their children play. Hosa emerged from the building and settled beside him on the steps, baby Hope's younger brother Timothy sleeping peacefully in her arms. Timothy had been born 2 years earlier, making Hosa one of the few residents who had expanded her family while living at the community house. "Remember when you thought 10 women and a baby were too many people?" she asked, watching the bustling activity around them. Patrick chuckled. "Seems like another lifetime," he said. "Sometimes I can barely remember what it was like to live alone. You miss it? The quiet?" Patrick considered the question seriously. The building was never quiet now. There was always someone practicing piano in the music room, children playing in the halls, adults discussing community business in the main room, or newcomers arriving with their stories of loss and hope for a fresh start. "No," he said finally. "I thought I was living when I was alone, but I was just existing. This is living." As if to prove his point, Alice came running over from the playground, her face flushed with excitement and her dress covered with dirt from some adventure in the gardens. "Grandpa Patrick," she called, using the title that all the children had bestowed on him. "Hope found a bird's nest with baby birds in it. Can we keep them? Birds need to stay with their bird mothers," Patrick explained, lifting Alice onto his lap. "Just like little girls need to stay with their people mothers." "But we don't have people mothers," Alice pointed out with 4-year-old logic. "We have everybody mothers." She was right, Patrick realized. The community house had created something that traditional families couldn't provide. A support system where every adult took responsibility for every child, where no one faced their problems alone, where love and care were not limited by biology or law but extended freely to anyone who needed them. As the sun set over Brooklyn, Patrick looked out at the community they had built together and felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with collective success. They had taken broken lives and broken dreams and built something whole from the pieces. They had created not just a place to live, but a way of living that proved kindness was stronger than cruelty, community more powerful than isolation, and hope more enduring than despair. Somewhere in the building behind him, dinner was being prepared by a rotation of volunteer cooks. Homework was being supervised by adults who had learned to read in Dorothy's classes. Medical care was being provided by people who had discovered healing talents they never knew they possessed. Stories were being told in multiple languages to children who were growing up believing that the world was fundamentally good, despite all evidence to the contrary. The silence that had defined Patrick Holly's life for 30 years was gone forever, replaced by the beautiful noise of people choosing to care for each other. And sitting on those front steps with Alice in his arms and Hosa beside him, surrounded by the laughter of children and the satisfaction of adults who had found purpose in service, Patrick finally understood what Ruth had tried to tell him all those years ago. That love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to express itself. The red ribbons he had once used to mark the boundaries of his solitude now tied back the curtains of the community house windows, letting in the light that had always been there, waiting for someone brave enough to open their doors and let the world come in.